without much further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Heberle so she can discuss the climate and economic justice screening tool. So Lauren, take it away.
Larry, thanks for that presentation. I hadn't gone through the TRI, the newer interfaces on the EPA recently on the TRI, and it's shown huge improvement in the last couple of years that I think makes it much more accessible to folks. So I'm hoping that as I talk, folks will have some ideas about how to connect the two, because I'll be talking more about community level measures in this particular, with this that are available with this particular tool. Because, well, I am a sociologist. I teach at the University of Louisville in the sociology department, and I run the Center for Environmental Policy and Management. My background is in brownfields redevelopment and other kinds of land reuse processes. Cleanup, redevelopment is where I kind of got my feet wet. And in most recent years, I've come to be the Community Engagement Core Director for the University of Louisville Superfund Research Center that focuses on the health impacts of volatile organic compounds. That center is fairly new for U of L, and so we're still getting our feet on the ground, but they're making, I'm learning a lot from them about health impacts and how to connect those with land reuse and cleanups. So today I'm going to share a bit with you about the U.S. Council's Environmental Qualities, Climate, and Economic Justice Screening Tool. And then I'll talk a little bit about a few other data sources. I think in the face of the recent Supreme Court ruling that limits the EPA's regulatory authority over greenhouse gases, it's become ever more important to find the alternative routes to address legacy and ongoing environmental harms in our communities. I and others see the potential in the executive order 14008 that enables the Biden administration's Justice 40 initiative and created the Climate Economic Justice Screening Tool. I also think Kentucky's communities have huge potential to move the needle on climate justice coalition building by centering racial justice, but we'll talk a little bit more on that later, I hope. So first today, I'm going to set out a brief discussion of the policy context and a few important past efforts that set the stage for where we find ourselves. Then I'll lay out a few key elements of the Justice 40 initiative and why I think it has the potential to address environmental harms and contribute to a just environmental future. The meat of the material, of course, today we'll be walking through just a few examples of how the tool can be used to characterize our community's environmental and economic conditions. Finally, I'm going to suggest a few other tools, like Larry did, that one could use to further understand the historical and current conditions. I'm going to encourage you to use these tools to see how the TRI inventory that Larry showed you can be further contextualized. For example, the TRI data can show you the individual facility releases. It can show you the releases by the zip code, as he said, by state, different geographic areas. It can show you the combination of several different kinds of chemical releases in particular areas. And then I'd like you to consider how this can be used in the context of other environmental, economic, and social vulnerability. So what came before Justice 40? I think it's always important to recognize the work that folks have done that lead up to these kinds of policies, because it's never done without a huge ton of work, as many of you have been a part of, I'm sure, throughout the years as you've all been involved in environmental work, but extraordinary work by environmental justice and climate justice advocates and frontline communities has had an impact over the years and should never be ignored. And the truth about policymaking is that it never goes unchallenged, right? We see that with recent Supreme Court case. But I wanted to set the stage with these few key moments in federal policy that puts Justice 40 and the screening tool into context. So in 1983, The U.S. General Accounting Office issued a report documenting that hazardous waste landfills were more likely located in areas with 26% or more Black households with incomes below poverty level at that point in time. With the exception of the establishment of the Office of Environmental Justice, the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and the Environmental Justice Small Grants Program, all of which are important milestones, don't get me wrong, but they've had very limited impact, overall. The federal policy and action on environmental justice was mostly silent until President Clinton issued Executive Order 12898 in 1984 that required all federal agencies to develop strategies on how to identify and address disproportionately adverse human health and environmental effects of their programs, policies, and activities on minority and low-income populations. The order also established an interagency working group on environmental justice. And between Clinton's executive order and Biden's Justice 40 initiative, federal environmental justice policy has mostly been about getting federal agencies to examine and revamp their internal practices and decision-making processes, include environmental justice assessments and permitting processes and small grants to communities. Several administrators have put EJ at the center of their agency platforms, but there's never been significant dollars focused on addressing EJ directly. And even when regulatory action, cleanups, and remediation happened, was more likely to happen in wealthier, whiter communities, despite the efforts of numerous task force reports and cross-agency efforts. So it wasn't until 2012, for example, that each of the federal agencies fulfilled Clinton's executive order to develop internal strategies for addressing environmental justice. So between 2012 and 2016, there were more reports, more guidance on how to include EJ in permitting, and reports intended to help communities navigate legal challenges. And just as Trump took office and the EJ 2020 action agenda was issued. But as we all are aware, not much happened except for the dismantling of the EJ office in 2020. In the midst of all of this, folks on the ground at the state level and local governance levels continue to work on various strengths across the country. And environmental justice activists and advocates have built a really strong, deep network that should never be undercounted. Their work has made it imperative that we approach understanding climate change through an environmental justice framework. Another thing that happened in 2015 was the release of EJ Screen. So Larry talked about that particular tool a little bit. And it was released to the public. It had been developed in 2012 as an internal tool for EPA to use as a way to see where they needed to put their priorities internally. EJ Screen is still used, it's still updated, and I'd argue that this and other advances in online data accessibility open the door for the public to see and understand information in very different ways in their own communities. We still have the digital divide to deal with, but that's where a lot of us come in helping folks figure out how to access that and translate the information as well and make it useful for folks on the ground in the ways that they see fit or need and address their own priorities. Concurrently, as many of us are aware, our history on federal action on climate change, of course, is dismal. And even under the most climate change friendly administrations, we've not seen substantial enough action to address the US contributions to the climate crisis. So now I want to jump to the Justice 40 initiative. So Executive Order 14008 lays out the Biden administration's approach to climate change and the ever-expanding crisis it engenders. It includes a whole government approach and includes what has been called the Justice 40 initiative. Lou Daly, he's the Deputy Director of Climate Policy at the Roosevelt Institute, describes Justice 40 as such. Although ultimately framed as part of a federal climate strategy, Justice 40 broadly aims to ensure that in multiple climate-related policy areas, including climate mitigation, clean energy, clean transportation, sustainable housing, and environmental protection, federal investments should deliver at least 40% of overall benefits to disadvantaged communities. Disadvantaged refers to communities most harmed by the fossil fuel economy and most at risk from the climate emergency. The core concepts in this designation are environmental burden, that is existing pollution disparities at their sources, and climate vulnerability, the socioeconomic and discriminatory conditions that greatly increase climate risks, and in some communities as compared to others. So it includes a ranking of communities. So because the order demands that 40% of federal investments in climate-related areas benefit disadvantaged communities, that means they had to have a way of defining communities so that they could, one, target them for spending, and two, document that 40% of the investments did indeed go to benefit those communities. So they had to create a definition that they think can withstand constitutional and other legal review, and a data visualization tool to help federal agencies primarily, and those who apply for federal funding, identify eligible areas for those investments. So you can imagine that this is contentious, right? So now consider that they didn't include racial demographics in the definition of a disadvantaged community. They did that for very specific and political reasons, right? This is federal funding being spent in communities. And so to withstand a legal challenge with this current Supreme Court that we have, they opted to keep racial demographics and racial considerations out of this tool, out of this determination. So we can talk a little bit about what that means and whether or not, and there's a whole big debate about all of that going on. But that said, the screening tool has been launched for the public and for public input. And they finished up their comment periods, I think, and I believe they've also finished up all the EPA-sponsored sort of training tools. But there's still ways to get feedback to the EPA about specific determinations that you see on there, and we can speak to that. So these are the links to the tool, and these are in the document that I've given to Amy to email to you all, and so you can take a look at it on your own time, or as I talk about it, I'll pull up the website in a bit. When you click on the site, you can jump right in and put in your address or the area, and the map will zoom to where you can click on the census tracts and see how the tract you select is ranked on several different measures that speak to the areas that have experienced historical contamination, current pollution issues, as well as community health, education, and economic conditions. So I also want to bring attention to the methods piece of this. They're transparent about that, and I've got a link for you. You can get to the link there as well. So this is a quick look at the methods documentation provided for the Council on Environmental Quality. So a particular census tract must meet the criteria of at least one of 8 areas of measurement ranking. And so those are climate change, clean energy, energy efficiency, clean transit, affordable and sustainable housing, proximity to legacy pollution, whether or not it ranks high for wastewater discharges, health burdens, and where it sits in terms of workforce development and training. And so then again, within each of these, there are measures in that area in combination with income and education measured, and that's measured similarly for 7 of these, and slightly different for the training and workforce areas. So you'll see under climate change, for example, the census tract is if it's at or above the 90% percentile for expected agricultural loss rate or expected building loss rate or expected population loss rate And there at the bottom, you'll see is at least the 65th percentile for low income and 80% for individuals 15 or older who are not enrolled in higher education. Now, I personally have some issues with the ways in which they've set these limits or set these boundaries. I still haven't figured out why they're using the census category of individuals 15 or older not enrolled in higher education. I think that's probably about census data limitations, but I haven't quite dug that one out yet. I imagine this is going to go through another iteration as this is in a beta form. That said, I've not seen something like this before where it takes into consideration all these different types of impacts related to climate change that are also related to how we would address those impacts, like the areas of spending and the areas of funding. So I think this is a very interesting and potentially powerful framework for thinking, even as they're going to end up tweaking it at some points. It also permits us to think about disadvantaged in a very intersectional way as well, in terms of that's how we nationwide, those kinds of things vary based on the population variation, our history, what kind of industries we have, the cost of living, different types of health burdens and things like that. So I think I'll be interested to see how it plays out. And again, the primary purpose of this is for internal federal accountability, for internal federal programs. But I also think that it could be used for communities to advocate in different ways and to put things into contexts of cumulative impacts of different types of social vulnerabilities or historic discriminatory practices. So again, what we don't see here are race and ethnicity as factors that should be considered. And this is because the tool is about distribution. Again, it's about distribution of federal investments, and the creators knew that there would be legal challenges to this if they specifically identified race as a factor. So the definition of disadvantage is already problematic. However, I think the ability to achieve some amount of racial justice in this program is indeed possible. And I'd like to, so I think what I'd like to do now is we'll look at the tool a little bit more closely. So this is just showing you what will happen when you go to the tool and you click on one of the areas, one of those 8 areas. In this case, I clicked on climate change, and this happens to be for Madison County. It's been expanded to show you that within this measure for the county to be considered disadvantaged within the climate change area, it has to be above one of the 3 climate vulnerability measures. So that's the expected loss of agriculture, building loss rate, population loss, all related to and all of this is related to natural hazards, right? Excuse me, sorry. They must also be at or above both income and education thresholds. And in this case, it's below the poverty threshold, but above the measure for population enrolled in college. So overall, Madison County is not going to be, this area is not going to be considered disadvantaged in terms of how it would be characterized for to be count towards this 40% of investments, right? So I'm gonna, this is what the map looks like. It's a very, very simple database, website, which is nice. You can, as you zoom in, you can zoom in and get to the census. It's got all the census tracts listed, identified here. I'll zoom into Louisville for right now. You can see that as I click on this, I look at climate change, and it does not, none of this, we don't have any agriculture, so it's not going to lose anything. We're ranked at 42nd. within we're below the 90th percentile for building loss. At population loss, that's actually not too far from the 90th percentile, but we're definitely above the 65th percentile in low income, and of course below for higher education, given that we're right here in Old Louisville, right next to the university. We can look at other things like clean transit. And this particular census tract, this is how the ways in which they measure that, and the potential exposure. You can get that information here, right? Let's look at the southern part of the Parkland neighborhood. So this is in West Louisville. For those of you who don't live here, this area is just north of the Rubbertown facilities. And you can see that it is identified as disadvantaged. It's not expected to lose much ag. It's not expected to have much building loss due to hazards. It's not expected to lose too much population as a result of the natural hazards. But where it is high is in low income and higher education. So this is going to be true for all of the different categories, right? So it doesn't necessarily hit it for climate change, right? Where does it hit it? Clean energy and energy efficiency. So the energy burden is in this category here. And so this is the average annual energy burden cost divided by household income. So you can imagine in areas where you've got very low income and high energy costs, this is where this hits. And that's important in a lot of different ways, especially when we're talking about heat island impacts, which Louisville is really in danger of. This actually surprised me about the PM 2.5 in the air for that particular area. So you'll also find, a gut check on some of this about assumptions you make, given what you know about, or what you think you know about areas as well. I can give you a gut check. I would also say that some of this data is challengeable, right? If it doesn't look right to you, it could be based on older data that hasn't quite been updated or what have you. You have to make sure that you take a look to ground truth the data that you're looking at, especially when you're looking at census tracts. And then you get the income and education components as well. So this particular census tract ends up being characterized as disadvantaged based on having this this clean energy and energy efficiency piece. But it also has it for all of these other characters that when you see the blue dot, that means that's the other areas that it's been characterized as. So some sustainable housing, cost burden is a huge deal, right? Legacy pollution is another one. These are all these homes here are in close proximity to hazardous waste facilities. Given you've got Rubbertown right down to the south of it, and many other industrial facilities there, and sites that are on the NPL list. So this one in particular makes this legacy pollution is because of the proximity to properties that are that fall under the risk, have a risk management plan, right? So that's all of Rubbertown. That captures most of the Rubbertown facilities there. So you can play around with that within each of your with census tracts across the state of Kentucky. The health burdens is another one that is I think very interesting and important that it gets to be included. Health data is hard to come by at the census tract level. So these are going to be estimates, right? Most health data sits at the county level. It's a fairly new kind of estimate that they draw from using CDC data, I think. But I think it creates a picture for why a particular census tract or group of census tracts may have a more benefit greater from the federal investment, right? And why it might be more important to prioritize. So remember, these are rankings in these scores. So it's comparing these census tracts to all the other census tracts in the country, right? And so it's the ultimate tool is to help the federal government figure out how and where to put that 40% and how to document that 40% that it needs to benefit these areas. That said, I also think it can be used for an advocacy tool, and we can talk about that in a little bit. So you'll see that this area has a huge problem with health exposures, and of course we can argue that most of this is due to the proximity to the industrial exposures over a lifetime. Even as we've seen, as the TRI data show us, that they are decreasing, it's still it's still not necessarily below a healthy threshold. The other thing that you can do here is they have, what I also appreciate of what the EPA has been doing a lot lately, is allow you to get access to the raw data. And so you can download this stuff, and for those with a technical capacity, you can play with it in their own way and to examine it in more detail, to be allowed to be critical of it. So I think that's a really important piece. So the next thing, the one other thing I wanted to show you is their actual methodology page. So that goes over the slide that I had, gives you a little bit more detail, some hot links to how they define each of these categories, and allows you to see what the data sets they're using for each of the categories as well, what they're based on. And that'll give you an idea of why they've chosen it. So then they have this help improve the site and the data place where you can click. And then I think if you go back to the map and we click on a census tract, you see this send feedback here. If you come up with, if you're looking at a census tract here and you see something that's just completely off in one of these categories, you can send feedback to the EPA about it here. And the couple of times that I've done it, I've actually got an email back. So they are, at least they did at the beginning. It was early on. I got a response. They didn't change the census tract immediately. I imagine they're making lists of all the comments and prioritizing them for the next version of this, for how they're going to update it. All right. So now I'm going to go back to PowerPoint. And so I still ask that, how can this in any way be okay if we can't explicitly identify and include areas that are predominantly minoritized residents? And what about documenting the racialized concentration of Black, African American, Indigenous, Hispanic, and other ethnically minoritized communities? That question still sits heavily, even as we know that a lot of these other categories, the ways in which we define, the concentration of poverty, or the concentration of our proximity to hazardous waste sites, we know that those are correlates. And so there is some logic in being able to address that, even as it's not explicit. But so what do I and others see as the potential for Justice 40 in this particular screening tool for bringing needed assessments to address climate and environmental justice in Kentucky? Well, it really is about that 40% of federal climate dollars, related program funds, to be spent to benefit these communities. I think it's huge. This is different from programs like Opportunity Zones and other federal investment programs that ended up displacing poor and Black neighborhoods, or those that simply put dollars into the hands of the private sector without documentation of community benefits. So the folks at Appalachian Voices, for instance, have begun raising awareness of the potential funding that could be attached to Justice 40. And they've written a great piece describing the tool in really accessible terms, and how to provide feedback to them and other areas that are not characterized appropriately. So that link is to that article is also in the list that I shared with Amy that you'll be getting your hands on. And so now that I've talked about this tool, I wanted to direct you to two others that do explicitly include racialized environmental harm and are also useful characterizing community level environmental and demographic information as you confront things like applications for permitting a new industry or holding existing existing industry accountable, when you advocate for focusing on local, state, or federal resources on cleanup and protection, and really any new climate-related programs at any level. I think you can use these maps and these characterizations of particular census tracts to say this money needs to go here, or this program needs to go here. So as legislation comes up, or as the state is applying for particular types of programs, to make sure that they're paying attention to the census tracts in the appropriate way, I think leads to a little bit more transparency and puts another tool in the advocacy tool belt for folks. EJ Screen was mentioned earlier, and there's a new site from the Center for Disease Control that I wanted to share that focuses on health and environmental justice. And these are just two federal resources, and there are many others. As you can saw in the TRI data set, the website that Larry shared with all of those. So the environmental justice screening mapping tool is quite usable. I do want to say that it's a conversation starter rather than, and I think about this as TRI as well, that it is TRI because it's voluntary information. EJ Screen, it includes TRI and other data, environmental data. There's a datedness to it, right? So it's not necessarily about being able to hold someone legally responsible for a particular release. That comes from other kinds of data, other kinds of reporting, other kinds of monitoring processes, right? These sites are useful for, I think, for identifying trends, identifying ways of bringing attention to what's going on in your community, and also gives folks language for talking about the layeredness of harm and the interactions that happen when you are living near a particular type of industry, and you have economic challenges, and you experience racial discrimination on a daily basis, and you've got health problems or lack of health access, adequate health care, and you might have gaps in critical services or infrastructure. So these ways of talking about these things in a layered level, I think is a really important piece of the story for fighting for improved health and protecting our communities. So EJ Screen is a good and easy one. And then this is the fairly new site from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. I will say I'd love to hear more back from folks as you all, again, the links are going to be in the document that I shared with you, and I can pull up the website if you'd like to play around with it. It's got a multi-level way of looking at environmental justice data as it connects to health data. And so their approach, the CDC's approach, is again as a conversation starter to give people an idea of what's going on, and then allow you to go deeper into the data should you choose to do so, but to give folks a good enough taste of what's there and why this kind of thing, why linking these kind of data are important. And then moving forward, they have a lot of data on this one, but it is also some of it is pretty dated. So you have to pay attention to it in that way. But I think having the potential to have the shell up for future updates is going to be important. I think they had to get it rolling. I give the federal government a lot of credit for making sure that you can't have it out there unless you have a structure that works to get the data into it, right?